Hello and welcome to this edition of EdTech Mondays Africa. My name is Joy Doreen Bira, and it's so good to have you on yet another edition where we're having a special conversation on inclusive technology for learners with disabilities. Now, if you have read the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it defines persons with disabilities as those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. On this edition of EdTech Mondays Africa, we are seeking to find solutions on how exactly education technology can be harnessed to support learners learning with disabilities at all levels of education across Africa. And joining us to have this conversation, we've got Georgine Auma, who is the founder and director, Studio KSL at eKitabu here in Kenya. We also have Zachary Nyange Mwasia, who is an educator on disability inclusion and assistive technology. He's also a lecturer at Kenya Institute of Special Education. And we also do have, joining us online, we've got Anna Maria Tammy, who is a senior education specialist, thematic lead for equity and inclusion at Global Partnership for Education, GPE. And we also have Andre Okunzua, a lead disability inclusion programs at the MasterCard Foundation. It's so good to have you all on the EdTech Mondays conversation this month. And I would like to start with a general question to all of us. And maybe it would be important to start with Zachary, and a specific question to Zachary to just take us through what it was like going to school as a blind learner.
Wow, thank you and for having me. Now, having education as a blind learner, it was not very easy, although I must say that those that were involved really tried their best. I studied here in Kenya, in one of the special schools called Thika School for the Blind, both primary and secondary levels. Now, during that time, it wasn't easy just because of the fact that we had limited resources, and especially when it came to materials like braille books and, mathematical materials to use and all that. So for braille books, for example, when it came to, say reading, for example, set books, it was challenging because, when sharing a braille book for, learners with visual impairment, it means that when my friend or colleague is reading, then I have to sit and just listen. And, with that, then it means that I'm not able to interact with the words. Hence, I found myself being apathetic in terms of spelling. So it wasn't really easy at all. I remember some time in high school where we had to even get to a point of having revision books. Now, these revision books were not really produced in Braille because producing in Braille is quite hectic and also costly, as I understand. And so we could not have all the revision books in Braille. So what happened is that in the school at the time, we had some friends of mine who were low vision. So they would be able to read printed text, especially the large print when it is close to their eyes. So they would find themselves bringing up, groups that they would support in learning. So eventually the groups became too large and they had to find a way to control them. So one of the best way to control, according to them, was having a token of appreciation. So you realize that personally, because I was not able to afford that, I would find myself, sitting and, listening in to a group discussion that I'm not invited, but pretending to be, organizing my desk and, my sheets of paper, in Braille, we write a sheet at a time, then we bind them. So pretending to be organizing them, yet I'm just sniffing in to just hear what they are saying. And then that will lead to me not sleeping at all because one group would be there maybe, say, in the evening, say 21, 100 hours all the way to 2,300 hours, and they will go to rest. Another group may have already gone to rest that time, and then now they come up at 23 all the way maybe to, say, 24 hours. So you see, I may end up not resting, just listening. So it wasn't easy, but I thank God I was able to do it.
I can imagine how challenging that might have been, especially knowing that that was pretty much your life from the time you started or enrolled into education up until you completed. I'd also want to hear Georgine's side of the story, because I'm thinking there are some similarities, but also there are differences, especially knowing that she is having a hearing impairment and yours is a visual impairment. But I want to hear Georgine's story as well.
I personally became deaf when I was 9 years old. At that time, I was already in school, in a hearing school. So my parents tried to find a school where I can join, but they couldn't find one. So what they decided is to buy me hearing aids, which did not work for me, but they supported me to be accepted back into the same school that I was studying before. So I was in a regular school where there was no support for me as a deaf person. And what happened is that I would sit in the front of the class to try and lip read the teacher. But you get only like 30% of that, whatever is taught. And so for me, good luck. My father was also a teacher. And at that time, he saw me and saw the struggles that I had at school. And he was a teacher of mathematics. And so he brought me textbooks and encouraged me to go and study on my own. I would go to the library. I would stay at school. When I sit in class, I don't understand anything. But when I come back home, my father gives me books which I could read. At home, I would read by my own. And so I would say I taught myself through school, because I went to school, yes, but the teachers did not teach me because I could not understand. And that's why I decided to become a teacher as well, because I saw this challenge. I can teach. I can support other deaf learners who are struggling out there. So I went to Maseno University and I trained to become a teacher. And then I was posted to Ngala School for the Deaf. I joined school. I was really excited to teach. But truly what I found, there was no accessible teaching and learning material specifically for deaf learners. And that's why I am doing what I'm doing right now, because we are creating accessible digital content for deaf and hard of hearing children.
Wow, that's really amazing. I'd now like to come to Anna Maria and also Andre, who are joining us online. And I'll start with you, Anna Maria. You know, based on the experiences of both Georgine and Zach, it pretty much speaks to the global situation as well, but with an African perspective, and specifically looking at Kenya and what the education system is like. But from a global perspective, there's so much that needs to be worked on in terms of inclusion or inclusivity where education is concerned. What are your thoughts around, first of all, the experiences that Zach and Georgine have shared, and what exactly do we need to do to make education more wholesome for all learners across board?
So I think the examples that have been shared were really exemplary. And I mean, at the global level, we're looking at about 240 million children who are living with a disability. So that's roughly 1 in 10. We know the data is not very good. There's lots of children that aren't being counted, even as we speak, and whose difficulties aren't being identified in school. So these numbers are very challenging by default. But roughly, let's say that 1 in 10 we're talking about here. And so we know that children with disabilities are almost 50% more likely than other children to have never attended school. And, you know, when they are in school, we know that the outcomes are worse in terms of being able to complete schooling or being able to achieve the same learning outcomes as other children. We know that children with disabilities lag behind in foundational numeracy and literacy, for example. And it becomes even more challenging when different barriers intersect. For example, girls with disabilities we know are the most marginalized children all the way from primary school to higher education settings. So that's a little bit the picture globally. And then if we look at the barriers of what's in the way, it's certainly the things that were already mentioned by the previous speakers. So, you know, it is still negative attitudes in communities and among teachers themselves. It's also inaccessible school buildings and the lack of assistive technologies that can then help children with disabilities to really participate and to learn when they are at school. It's not just about being in the classroom. It's actually then participating and learning, which counts. There's also issues, of course, of training teachers. Of course, teachers already face massive challenges in terms of big classroom sizes, not enough materials. So there's a lot to do there in terms of supporting those inclusive learning materials, supporting teacher knowledge and skills to manage the diverse needs of schools. A couple system level barriers, which is really the data challenge and the financing of inclusive education, because both those things we need to really fix in order to make progress for inclusion globally. So the data really is key, because without good data, education systems don't plan for inclusion accurately, and they don't finance it. They don't budget for it sufficiently. And so ultimately the systems aren't financing what's not visible. And so that's why really being able to identify functional difficulties of children is one of really the building blocks of an inclusive system.
Great. Thanks a lot for that. And, it's interesting that you mentioned there is a data challenge, because Zach and I were having a conversation about how there is inconsistent data when it comes to capturing the numbers of learners who are living with disabilities. But according to UNESCO, it estimates that 93 million children under the age of 14, or about 5.1% of the world's children, live with a moderate or severe disability, with 4 in 5 children with disabilities living in developing countries, with the highest populations being in sub-Saharan Africa. And that does speak to a number of other related barriers or challenges that come with that inconsistent data. Andre, I want to come to you as well. And as a lead, for disability inclusion programs at the MasterCard Foundation, tell us about some of the programs that the foundation is working with, or some of the initiatives that the foundation is currently working on with different partners that are helping learners with disabilities.
So the MasterCard Foundation believes that all young people, no matter their starting point in life, should have access to quality education and access to employment, including youths with disabilities. One of our programs on this is a collaboration with the University of Gondar. Like every of our scholars program is to really improve access to quality education, but for this program in particularly targets more young people with disabilities, with the goal of reaching about 450 young people. Majority of that will be people with disabilities. Also, as part of that program is really strengthening approach around transitions for people with disabilities from higher education to employment. So just being more intentional around how we support the young scholars with disabilities around transitioning, preparing them for the world of work. Also, there is the piece around collaboration with Queen's University that focuses around really capacity strengthening for faculty for Gondar University. So it's quite an exciting program that we are learning from. We also have a partnership with Light for the World, which focuses around really mainstreaming disability inclusion across the MasterCard Foundation. And from all of these, particularly the partnership with Gondar University, we've really learned that people with disabilities, whether it's visually impaired, hearing impaired, require 80 for them to be able to effectively take part in the classrooms. We're also learning that the lecturers and the staff need to have a bit of an understanding around disability inclusion and disability inclusion awareness for things around, for example, providing examinations that are inclusive and accessible. Right, providing discussions in classrooms that are accessible to everyone in the classroom, and just really understanding the individual young person with a disability to understand their reasonable accommodation needs would better prepare the young person for learning and, of course, for work as well. Good to connect some of these learnings with what Zachary and Georgine have shared.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot for that, Andre. And it's really great to know some of the programs that the foundation is supporting as well, and the collaborative partnerships that we're looking at. I want to bring the conversation back to studio. What more do you think needs to be done to make education more wholesome for learners with disabilities? Because as is, we are not yet even halfway there. Let me start with Eugene.
Maybe I can speak as a teacher first. From my experience as a teacher and specifically teaching deaf children, I think what we need to support these deaf children is to have accessible and inclusive and quality education for them by training the teachers, because a teacher is a center for learning. So we need to also have the content. So when the teacher knows how to serve the learner, how to support the learner with disability, they can be able to empower them in the correct way. If we support the teachers to have the right skills, then connecting that with children with disability, they can support them academically.
I don't know how to best reiterate just what Eugene just said, because it is true that with training teachers, that would really mean a lot, because it means that, first of all, they will be able to understand the different methodologies on how to support learners with different disabilities. Now, I always love to reiterate the fact that, I'm visually impaired. Impaired is the term. But then when I meet you who is not accommodating my needs, then you're the one causing my disability. The disability is about the environment that is around me. So if we happen to empower teachers, then it means that we shall have reduced the chances of disabilities around persons with different impairments. Secondly, I think the need for use of technology. Assistive devices would really transform things, and especially in terms of access to education of learners with disabilities. If I had to give an example of what I was mentioning, of having shared, say, Braille books, for example, that was just because of the challenge of, the cost that is incurred in producing Braille books. But then if it were in terms of technology, then that would mean that little efforts would be needed, and especially when it comes to accessing real-time information. So you realize that a Braille book, for example, purchasing the paper, it's recurrent. So, but then when you purchase a piece of technology, like just a piece of maybe like a refreshable Braille display like the one I'm using here, then it becomes easier for those learners to access information even when it is real time.
It's important that you've actually said the piece of Braille, and I'm assuming that this is an example of technology as well. But talk to us about the possibilities of technology for a learner living with an impairment today.
For a learner with impairment, technology makes things possible, whereas to the rest of you, technology makes things easier. If I were to just give us an example, if we were in a conference, say, for example, all of us having a forum going on, then for whatever reasons there's a cut of electricity and we can no longer project, then all of you will very quickly shift to, say, use of the chats, the flip chats, and the meeting will go on. You'll also shift to using, say, notebooks, your notebook and a pen. But for me, if I'm using a laptop and there's a cut of electricity, then it means that I shall have actually been shattered completely. I'll not be able to continue. So meaning that for the rest of the people in the room who are using laptops to, take their notes and all that, that was only making, their interaction easier. It was making it easier. But for me, it was making it possible. So technology makes things possible for persons with disabilities. When it comes to access of information, which is key, then you realize that if I may stick again on a Braille book, for example, if we produce something like today, we have EdTech Mondays produce maybe, say, a monthly magazine. Before it is produced in Braille, then there'll be several other months, or maybe before it is produced and reaching the people, the users who would need to use it in Braille, then it will take time. But then with technology, that could be real time. So you see, when you change the access to information, then that shall have really been a different, a game changer in terms of education. And secondly, things to do with mathematics, for example. In some cases, persons with disability tend to learn mathematics as if it were history, because resources are rare and some are also costly. So you realize that you may be taught, say, algebra as history. I don't know how many of us would understand algebra if it were taught as history. Just hearing someone mention, and then you're not able to interact with it just because you do not have the adequate resource.
Right. You've actually said something very profound, that technology makes it possible for learners with disabilities. And while it makes it easier for us, it makes it possible for learners with disability. I think that's really profound. And I want to dig deeper into that by just trying to understand the solutions that Georgine is developing under Studio KSL at eKitabu that are supporting learners with hearing impairment.
So what specifically we're doing at Studio KSL is that we know that 90% of deaf children start school without any language. And that means their first exposure to sign language is when they step into a class. And we know for a fact that teachers don't always know sign language. And children come to school without language as well. And so unskilled teacher, unskilled children. So we have a big gap. The lack of language foundation connected to the curriculum as well. So children who are deaf and hard of hearing are delayed in literacy because of the issue of language, and the teacher is not skilled in sign language. So what we're doing to try and close that gap is to provide accessible digital materials where they can watch videos, acquire language, and also the teacher can watch and learn sign language. If the children know sign language, the teachers knows sign language, it becomes easy to progress in the curriculum. So this is a gap that we are closing. But also eKitabu produces different accessible digital content. For example, we have Orbit readers. It's something similar to what Zach has here and he has mentioned. It's smaller than this, but you can have many content, a lot of content in that, and the teacher is able to use that. You can have up to 200 books in that Orbit reader. And so we load the content in also accessible EPUB, which is based on web content accessibility guidelines to support different learners, and it has different features for different learners' needs. Using web content guidelines, this supports us to add accessible features. For example, we have image description, meaning that a blind child who is watching a video is able to understand what's happening in that image. So there's an image description, and it also has caption and also translation into audio so that a blind learner is able to understand what's happening. We also have easy to read for children who have intellectual and learning disabilities.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Eugene. Anna Maria, I want to come to you just based on what Zach and Eugene have shared. You can almost see that there's a cost that is applied towards the technologies that they're investing in or that they are acquiring. And these costs are not very affordable most of the time to all learners living with disabilities. Now, how do we make this more accessible? What are some of the programs that at GPE you are working on to ensure that there is more access, for instance, not just to education, but to customized learning for learners with disabilities?
In terms of the power of EdTech, it's huge. It can be a very powerful tool if teachers have the right supports in place to use that technology to change classroom practices. And if that technology is designed in a way that has the end user in mind and actually, particularly is designed for children with, let's say, learning difficulties and different functional difficulties. So it is very powerful. I would also say EdTech has the power to help us across the system for things like better data systems management. I already talked about the difficulties we face in that area in terms of monitoring who has functional difficulties and monitoring learning outcomes. So that's also a kind of opportunity for EdTech. In terms of how we are helping governments make use of EdTech, we've launched a technical assistance initiative where we support a set of governments to identify what EdTech solutions and capabilities best fit their context and their needs, so that they can, make use of these different opportunities. Oftentimes, there's many different solutions that are being thrown at governments, and it can be quite difficult for them to understand what's the best fit, and also, as you mentioned, the resources. What do these things cost over the long term? Because, of course, it's not fair to assume that the costs of EdTech would be borne by households, by parents, because that would just widen inequalities. Ultimately, EdTech solutions to fit into the system need to be financed by governments. So we do need to help governments understand the long-term financial implications and how these solutions can be scaled up in a sustainable way. Because EdTech pilots are nice, but ultimately we want to make change across the system. So we need to be thinking about how do we best find solutions that can be mainstreamed across education systems at large. Some other key, I think, core principles are just using evidence to design solutions, and also thinking about protections for children, particularly when we're talking about online solutions.
And speaking of the technology aspect of it, we happen to speak to Mulune Atinaf, who is the e-learning coordinator, ICT education in Ethiopia. And we started by asking him, where are we as a continent in ensuring inclusivity of learners with disabilities in the education ecosystem? And we also asked him, what are some of those barriers that learners with disabilities in Africa encounter, and how these can be addressed by our governments? And let's take a listen to what he had to say.
In Ethiopia, we are trying to consider people with disabilities and with special needs to get maximum care while designing interventions with EdTech. As you know, it is providing a lot of opportunities to include people with disabilities to have access to education, to have access to resources, school facilities, and we are trying to implement a policy framework, and by developing that strategy and framework, we are setting some guidelines and procedures how these people with special needs, not only disabilities, will be included and will get the opportunities that the technology is providing. I'm not sure how other governments are doing it actually, but I am sure enough that they have policies and standards how to include these people in the conventional education system. The factors or barriers to include those people are multiple, and even the factors themselves are overlapping. I can mention, for instance, access to end-user devices, access to the internet, and access to educational facilities or materials. As you know, these people with disabilities, they are affected in a way to have access to job opportunities, and that again has an impact on their incomes. And because of this, they may not have the socio-economic abilities to buy or to pay for end-user devices, to pay for materials online, or to pay for to have access to digital content and the like. Stakeholders who are funding these EdTech entrepreneurs can appropriate another strategy so they can work on including, or they can work on EdTech that is inclusive or considerate of these people with special needs and disabilities, and a special grant should be appropriated. This is my perspective.
He's mentioned quite a number of issues there. Policies need to be designed with the needs of the learners with disabilities in mind. Andre, I want to hear your thoughts as well pertaining the work that the Mastercard Foundation is doing in supporting some of these policies as well, and also other work that is by far supporting more inclusion, especially where disability programs are concerned.
We are learning that there's need for more collaboration and partnership between the private and government sector to enhance accessibility more broadly, whether we're looking at accessibility within digital products and e-learning environment, or accessibility between built environment, or just general accessibility as a whole. That there's a lot of changes that's required to happen at the systems and institutional level to make this shift. And also, really, I think I would like to add, just really, as what we are doing, continue to engage more young people with disabilities in the conversation. I think for the Mastercard Foundation, that's one of the things we are trying to do more of, to engage more young people with disabilities, to really have a deeper understanding around the gaps, around the problems for accessibility, trying to really look at within our own programs to see how can we ensure that we deepen the reach to young people with disabilities by providing training to our partners, by ensuring that our programs are designed with inclusion from the inception, and really strengthen our collaborations with organizations of persons with disabilities.
Interesting. Ana Maria, what are your thoughts around what Atinaf mentioned in terms of policy and, having the needs of the learners in mind as we design or redesign policies around them to ensure that their learning experience is much better and that they don't feel excluded from the rest of the education ecosystem?
In terms of looking at the systems level, right? Looking at the policies and laws that are in place to ensure that the needs of people with disabilities are taken into account in all government plans and strategies. Because we want to design good solutions with end users in mind, and systems overall need to be putting the hardest to reach at the center when different policies and plans are put in place. But that you need to look at all parts of the education system to really build more inclusive systems. And we talked earlier in this conversation about the importance of building teacher skills and knowledge, about identifying functional difficulties, about having assistive technologies that then support children. So it's about how all of these pieces come together that you really build inclusive systems. And I'll give the example of Zanzibar, actually, which has been a partner country of GPE for a very long time. And Zanzibar actually did do a very intentional strategy that looked at all of these things. So firstly, They revised their policies. They set up a national council for disability, which then looked at how government plans address needs of people with disabilities. They then employed a mix of different approaches. So they looked at teacher training so that teachers could better identify difficulties in the classroom and have better classroom management skills for inclusion. They also looked at advocacy with communities, parents, and teachers to shift those negative attitudes. They provided children with hearing aids and glasses, as well as actually distributed about 250,000 inclusive learning materials to schools. So with this mix of approaches, it was possible for now about a third of schools in Zanzibar to offer inclusive education.
And I think there is also a bit of intentionality that is tied towards transformation that is very important and key in making sure that we leave no learner behind. And bringing that conversation back to Zach and Georgine as we bring this to a close, I want to hear from you, Zach and Georgine. What are some of the technological components that are a must-have for learners with disability, so that even for those who are designing technologies or technology tools, they need to factor in certain aspects so that they're not just easy for the rest of the learners or the able learners to use, but also for the learners with disability? Zach?
What Andre said is very critical, to make sure that everything that we do is, first of all, intentional and also born accessible. Born accessible, if I may use just maybe some of the common brands. For example, right now, Windows by Microsoft, for example, is providing a chance that when anyone buys a computer, then they would be able to, so long as they're running Windows 10 and above, they would be able to, press a certain key combination to turn on speech, a screen reader for those with visual impairment, abilities to turn on issues to do with magnification. And the same case with Apple and Google companies, they are really trying. I find that when I get to buy my phone, I have an option to just tap a certain option to have it start speaking immediately. So you see, that is not a phone that is meant for someone with disability per se, but then it is made with the idea that if in case it lands on a hand of someone with an impairment, then they have this option to make it accessible for them. So to all the developers, when we are doing anything, we need to make sure that we do not think of accessibility as the last option. No, we consider it from the start. In case that is challenging, consider involving more persons with disabilities, just like Anna Maria mentioned, so that to make sure that they would give you their opinion on what is it that they would expect to have in a device, in a software, to make sure that it is assistive to them.
Born accessible. I think that's a really critical aspect that all developers in the EdTech space need to factor in, because if that part is missed, it's easier to actually have it from the get-go, as opposed to going back maybe 1 year later, 2 years later into the use of the technology and then saying, oh, I think we missed this aspect of the solution. And so born accessible is very critical as well. Eugene, that message, I'm sure, is something that you've factored into your solution as well at Studio at KSL. But then I want to hear, what other factors do you think we need not miss when we are developing EdTech technologies?
Sure. Thanks, Joy. I don't know what to add, because what I thought of mentioning is what Zach has mentioned. Truly, I want us all to think about accessibility at the beginning of the production. So based on universal design for learning, this is where we know for a fact that people and learners learn in different ways. Whether they have a disability or they don't have a disability, we all learn in different ways. Some people learn best when they see something, others learn best when they hear something, others will learn best when they act or they do something. And so if we follow the universal design for learning, it means that when we are distributing our solutions, they are already accessible. And you're not making children with disability or people with disability have to wait for years and years for their content to be made accessible. For example, what Zach mentioned at their school, that they didn't have accessible books, but they would be thinking of, we'll have Braille. So by the time they make Braille, Zach is out of school. And so we need to take a step back and try and contribute and produce content that is already accessible at the beginning, at the designing level, and to know which accessibility features can be added, what is needed. It could be as simple as what Zach mentioned, just having a phone. It's not specifically for a blind person, but adding the feature such that if it gets to them, they're able to benefit. For deaf people, having some that is visual, where it's in sign language. For most blind people, if something has audio description or image description, it's easy for them to access. So it's not things that we need to scratch our heads about and think of all the cost. No, universal design for learning, that means that we have access for all. Thank you.
What would you recommend for increasing access to learning? If, say, there was a wish list somewhere, what would be on top of that list for us all? Eugene, I'm starting with you.
For me, education that is accessible for all. For now, children with disability get to different schools, which is not the regular school. And so if I'm in the village and I'm not able to access a school, what does that mean for me? So we need education that when a child is born in the village, they can be able to get into any other school that they want to. That's my wish.
I would love to just mention that everything starts with imagination. I would love that anybody that is in this space, in whichever category or whatever you're doing in life, just first of all, think, what if I couldn't hear? What if I couldn't see? What if I'm physically challenged? Would the piece of technology, would the piece of policy or idea that I'm putting on paper, would the building, would whatever thing that I'm doing be accessible to me? And then you'll definitely have the answer. Because once there's a goodwill, then the rest will move.
Goodwill. Andre, I want to hear your thoughts as well. What would be on top of your wish list where disability programs or improving the lives of learners with disabilities are?
I think what comes to my mind, first of all, is how do we engage more people with disabilities as experts in the discussion towards solving them. Just as we are discussing with Zachary and Jordan, they are experts, right? They have the lived experience, and we need more young people with disabilities on the table or around the table for these discussions, and then also to back those conversations with funding as well, right? So bring them to the table and give them what it takes to make that solution happen.
Firstly, more financing to the education sector. We know that education budgets were cut during the COVID pandemic in many countries, and those budgets haven't necessarily recovered to even the same levels. At the same time, we know that education systems are growing because there's a bigger population, so we need to, make sure that there's adequate funding being allocated to the education system as a whole. Then, of course, we need to talk about how that money is being spent. Is it spent well and efficiently? And most importantly, is it spent equitably? And how do we improve the ways that it is spent in ways that build a more inclusive system so that resources actually, do flow to schools so that schools can be made more inclusive and address a diverse range of needs of children.
Thank you all so much for such a great conversation we just had. And I believe that to everyone who is watching the conversation, we can almost tell that the intentionality needs to be prioritized for us to be able to know that we are making learners learning and living with disabilities a part of the general education ecosystem. Technology makes all things possible for learners with disability. It might make it easier for us, but it makes it possible for learners with disabilities. And then also born accessible. Born accessibility is something we also need to be intentional about. And I think also Georgine mentioned the fact that from the get-go, if we can make education inclusive from the beginning at the lowest level of learning, if we make that more inclusive for all learners, it would make it a lot more easier for learners learning with disabilities as well to feel included in the education ecosystem. And a lot more that has been discussed on the show. I'd like to thank you all for joining the conversation, and I hope you've picked one or two things that you can carry with you to make decisions if you are in a decision-making position. And if you are in the developing world, now you know where to start when developing assistive EdTech tools. And if you are a learner, at least you have an idea of what exactly you should be looking out for where assistive technologies are concerned. My name is Joy Doreen Bira. Until the next one, bye-bye for now.